I've been seeing a lot of posts recently on my feed related to abortion rights and Roe v. Wade. And, I know it's a very
Yeah.
heated topic, especially the last month or so. There's been a lot of peaceful protests, and people have been up in arms as far as Roe v. Wade being overturned. But to be really honest, I didn't know much about the actual bill Roe v. Wade. I knew it was a monumental landmark
No.
decision when it was made 50 years ago. So obviously, 50 years on, it being turned over and they're saying it's no longer standing, it's affected a lot of people. But I didn't know why. I knew what it meant, but I didn't know
To
why.
to be honest, the fact that it wasn't a law to begin with was probably the biggest shocker to me. I think it came as a surprise to a lot of people. I mean, you and I are not from the country, so I guess somewhere we're justified in not
Mhm.
knowing about it. But the fact that abortion rights are not a constitutional law, um, that was a shocker for me. I like it's mind-boggling because it is the United States that we're talking about. You know, by far the most
Right.
developed country in the world, or so it's claimed to be. And for something so basic to be a point of discussion in 2022 is just ridiculous. So, yeah, and I know it definitely hits home more for you than for me because, I mean, you are married, you have a family, you just had your first kid, and while kids are a joy, I mean, if there are medical complications, the fact that you are forced to have a child putting your life at risk is just,
It's not a choice
man,
then. It's a decision that's it's been made for
it's
you.
not a choice.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so I did look into it a bit just so that I could, we could have this conversation, and I wanted to see what
Yeah.
Roe v. Wade was, the original bill when it was passed. Bullet points are Roe v. Wade was passed in, I think, 1972 or 1973, but 50 years ago. And it started in
Yeah.
1969 with Jane Roe, who basically was a Texan in her early 20s. She wanted to have an abortion. And the thing was, back then in Texas, abortions were only allowed if it meant that your own personal health was in jeopardy. And this wasn't the case
Yeah.
for Jane Roe. So she said that, she basically was able to reach out to some lawyers who were actually looking to challenge this. And they went up
Right.
against Henry Wade, and hence the name Roe v. Wade. And they basically fought for the right for women to be able to have an abortion, within at least within certain parameters, not just be told like you can't have it, or it's just off the table. It's not a
Right.
discussion. It's a decision that a physician will
Yeah.
only take if your health is in jeopardy. Which again, in those days, you can look at it 50 years ago. You're like, okay, maybe 50 years ago, times were different, but basically what they've done
Yeah.
now by overturning Roe v. Wade is they've taken us back 50 years at least, if not more, right? And so what
Yeah.
the original Roe v. Wade said was that within the first trimester of a pregnancy, the decision to terminate was solely on whoever was pregnant. They decided if they wanted to keep the kid, if they wanted to have the pregnancy terminated at any stage. The second trimester
Right.
was where it became a little more about the government could regulate but not ban an abortion at that stage, because they had to look at the woman's health or the mother's health in that situation, and also the health of the fetus at that point. And the third trimester is where it was the state could prohibit abortion, but based on the fact that the mother's life was in jeopardy, but also that if they felt that the fetus could survive outside of the mother's womb in the third trimester, then it was
Yeah.
possible for them to ban abortion and say you can't abort at this stage. So the thing that I think people are right now up in arms about is the fact that the people who are against, who are were in favor of this being turned over and are absolutely pro-life, they're saying that before you could terminate an abortion at any stage, and Roe v. Wade is now because it's been overturned, that's not the case. That was never the case. These are clearly uninformed people who wanted to, who
Yeah.
misinterpreted like whatever their understanding of this bill was, and they're celebrating, even though they don't know what the actual effects of this is going to be on everyone, not just people
Right.
who can get pregnant.
I mean, lack of information in today's day and age is
Yeah, and
bad.
I thought it would be interesting to look at a few of the. I looked up a few articles related to the effects of what it's going to be to now that this has been overturned, and
Right.
uh, there were some really interesting points that I never really thought about. So the first one that's mentioned over here is the fact that abortions won't stop. Just because right now the precedent for whether abortions can happen or not is has been set statewide. So like, or it's independent on each state. So California might say that
Yeah.
no, and by the way, California has actually said that you cannot you
It
can't
will
ban
not stop.
abortions
Yeah.
over here. Right.
Ban
So,
abortions.
hats
Yes.
off to you, California. But
Which was
true,
expected,
but
right? I mean, if there's one state in the entire country that would highly oppose this, that's
right.
California. I mean, the day California decides that banning abortion rights are legal, um,
I know.
God bless the country.
Yeah, there's not a whole lot of hope left then. But I think that it says something that they actually went ahead and banned it. The fact that because that's what the country failed to do. The Fed at the federal level that didn't
Yeah.
happen. Like you said in the beginning, it was a bill, it was never a law. So, it could be overturned. And now, at least in California, I don't know what the steps would be, but it's a lot harder for them to want to and like reverse this. So yeah, the first point
Yes.
that they brought up as far as an effect of this Roe v. Wade being overturned is that abortions are not going to stop. People are going to get abortions. It's just that it's not going to be in a safe way anymore. It's not going to be, with the help of a trained physician or a medical expert.
That's obviously the other thing is that abortions, have been conducted throughout history. And especially the people who've been sort of pro-life historically as well, they've had mistresses who obviously had kids that they didn't want, and abortions did happen. Back in the day, there were no right procedures, and even if they were illegal, they would have, by taking poisonous chemicals in hopes that the child would, die, so to speak, which obviously puts you at huge risk. I know that, for example, I know this is moving away from the US, but I know in India there were cases where women would just down
Mm,
Clorox, right, and other harmful chemicals just because getting an abortion or the idea of an abortion was so
right.
stigmatized. Um, so yeah, it's always been unsafe if you don't go with the legal route, and the fact that you're not making it legal is just ensuring that more people die, are harmed, or their children that are born with deformities and other
Right.
disabilities.
Yeah. So it's
It's
not going to
such
stop.
nonsense.
Basically, people are going to find ways to get abortions. It's just not
No.
going to be safer for them. Um, Access is going to become harder. That seems obvious, but yes, getting access to an abortion if you're in a state where it has probably going to get banned means you have to travel to states where it's going to be
Right.
allowed, which is again really it's a lot because you're basically putting the pressure of getting that abortion on the individual, and it's becoming, I think it basically on this article it said that where before it used to be that a person might have to travel about 80 kilometers to get an abortion. Now, post Roe v. Wade being turned,
Right.
the average for the country, I think, is at 217 kilometers that they would have to travel just to get an abortion. So, which is
Yeah.
sad, but again, the pressure is on the people who need it. Um, and because of that, neighboring states are going to be affected. And
In terms of the inflow
it,
of
right,
patients
infrastructure,
and
because
timing.
they're set up to
Yes.
handle whatever the population is within the state that's going to need it, not outside, not outsiders. And obviously states want to help, but at the same time they have to be mindful of the fact that it's probably not going to happen for a lot of people if they are traveling all that distance and then they find out that there's like a long wait because the system's under
Yeah.
pressure to outperform.
I mean,
um,
I Yeah, I mean, not just this other states within the U.S., but I know that Canada also there's a certain concern over here. Of course, in Canada, healthcare is um, government mandated to a huge extent, so it's free for the general public. Um, so even if somebody does come from the United States, they'll probably pay from pocket, but it'll probably not be as expensive. The problem is that A, of course, it's a lot of
Right,
travel for an individual. So the communities that need it the most will most likely not be able
right.
to afford it. And two, it does put a lot of pressure on the Canadian
Yeah.
infrastructure because, uh, you know, anyways, because we don't have private insurance and not everything is private over here, there's a
Hmm.
wait list for almost anything you want, from surgeries to appointments. And then if you have heavy inflow from our neighboring country, which is the US, it's definitely brought up a lot of concern amongst a lot of people. But at the same time, people do understand and are empathetic and are like, will manage. But it's a sad state of affairs because some of the communities that suffer the most are communities that are the minorities and people who are not
Right,
financially well off. So this was already, tough on them to be able to say, take a day off from work wherever you are. And usually, if it's minimum wage work, you don't get that day off. But they would take that day off and travel and get that abortion or whatever
right.
care needed. But now to be taking a week off or something because you've got to travel to a different state or a different country uh, is
Yeah.
it's just really
It's
sad.
travel, it's your stay over there because you're going to need time to recover post-abortion. Abortions are not, a simple procedure. Even if it is early, it is it's painful for, the actual procedure. So it's like
Yeah,
it's a medical procedure at the end of the day. You're not traveling right back.
and psychologically also you need some time to
Right.
recoup from that, right?
So, so the
Uh,
next point they brought
yeah,
up was that people will be hit financially. And this point goes on to say that basically the demographic or the people who tend to who are most likely to have abortions are usually single women, and they're early on
yeah.
in their, they're maybe early 20s, maybe even sooner than that, but younger. And because of that, if they're not allowed, if you are allowed to have that abortion when you'd like to, because you know that you're not financially able to care for another, it's it's beneficial for both you and that potential child, because at the end of the day, if you're not able to look after someone, you're barely you don't make enough money, or maybe even living at home at that point with your parents, and you're suddenly trying to bring in another.
I hate to I hate to break it, but it's also less stress on the
Right,
government. Because if somebody's not able to financially support their own child, then the last straw is basically depending on the government and government, you know, um, subsidies or whatever it is, government support. Um, I don't know why you would want that on yourself if a certain individual is not. I mean, the number of children who are in
right,
foster care is insane, right? The number of people who and the other part is the US will not provide free healthcare. It's something that it is
right.
strictly against, right? But on the other hand, they're pro
No,
life. These two concepts are so conflicting that it's like, how do you, how does this make sense? And I know I'm just repeating something that everyone repeats. It's like, it's more of an agenda than, say, a smart decision. Uh, but I just had to bring it up. It's like, because even if the child is born and there is no support, medical or otherwise,
it's
I don't
difficult.
know.
And
I don't know where this
the
gets
I
into.
think that's the most common argument that's made by a lot of people who are pro-life is, why don't you, put that child up for adoption, don't terminate, let that child be born and put them up. And then you ask any of them, how many of you adopted? All these people who are how many have you
Exactly.
gone out and adopted yourself? And it's usually pretty funny because no one is like, oh yeah, I went and adopted all these kids who would have been aborted. Not really.
Everybody
Right.
wants their own blood.
So
And and we know that the foster care system in the US is not perfect. It's far
yeah,
from perfect. I mean, the number of households that a child goes through before it turns 18, they turn 18, is ridiculous. And once they turn 18, they're just given a bag with their stuff
right,
and let out with no support
right.
beyond that. So it's not like the foster care system will take care of these kids that are not wanted. It,
Yeah,
yeah,
it's basically on an. I mean, it seems like an immediate action that you're taking by banning abortion, but the long term ramifications are not. People. It's not something people want to talk about. Um, but and
yeah,
yeah, like we said before, more abortions could be unsafe because, like the first point said, abortions are not going to stop. People are going to find ways to get them. People are going to do it illegally. People are going to do it without medical supervision, and at the end of the day, that's just putting someone at risk in a situation where they shouldn't have to be put at risk, where it's completely avoidable and unfortunately not really. And because of that, maternal deaths are likely to rise. A lot of why abortions are not were not banned was because it was then up to, even if you are in a medical situation where it is probably smarter to abort because it's going to likely the child might not survive and you're putting the mother's life at risk. It's a tough decision, but it's also a decision that's you're able to make that decision because there's no law impeding it. And
right.
unfortunately now, because of that, death rates are going to rise. And you look at the states actually over here where they've listed the death rates are going to go up. It's insane. It's all the likely suspects, the Kentuckys, the Arkansas, the Alabamas. The estimated increases are much higher. There's a graph that shows that. um,
Yeah, and it's sad that we stereotype the southern states, but then data
yeah,
doesn't lie.
so yeah, it's quite a lot. I mean, at the end of the day, it is something that is going to be, there are long-term effects to this that we don't really know and we don't really understand. But these are the ones that have been pointed out. And having said that, there are companies out there that are going to be helping with abortion travel, like because it's hitting people and it's hitting employees of certain bigger companies as well. Companies are stepping up. They're trying to play their part, at least at the private level, to facilitate it to
Yeah,
whatever extent.
and most of them are the tech
Yeah, I
companies,
mean,
right?
we know a handful of people.
Like Amazon and Facebook, and basically all
Right,
these Bay Area startups that are now blue
right.
chip companies.
It
Um, they've always had a more liberal
Yeah,
outlook.
and
So,
um, and I think it's important to look at what this means moving forward, because one thing that cannot be discounted is that yes, this is the immediate effects of what's happened right now, but I read about Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas says gay rights, contraception rulings should be reconsidered after Roe is overturned. Now, where does this stop?
because all of these are not laws. They're all
Right.
bills. They were never signed into laws, and they're absolutely, you know, capable of being
It's
overturned.
and it's setting the precedent because right now these are, like you said, they're at the state level, and it's suddenly going to
Yeah,
be illegal in certain states to have a gay marriage. To I think even at this point,
yeah.
forget gay marriage. It's like, once you go for gay marriage, it's going to be about being gay in general, or yeah,
Just gay
just any
rights in
sort of gay
general.
rights and contraception rulings. I think if you look into this article, it's actually, I was surprised that this is even something that is on the table for discussion. But it says that within a married couple, the right to contraceptives can be taken away. Like, what does that mean?
I hate to say it, but certain states in India seem more progressive at
Oh
this
yeah,
point.
I didn't think so.
Women have
Yeah,
far more rights
I mean,
back
we
home.
we thought they didn't because on paper, it looked like the U.S. is more progressive. It is a Western country, and all that.
It's honestly, I'm not even talking on paper because I think when when we compare India to the United States, I think on by law, I think India always had rights for women, and a lot of times they're always there. The issues are more on society
Right.
as a whole, on how they would look at those rights. You know, even if a woman had the right to to get an abortion, or they had the right, society would look down on you when you wanted to
Right.
access those rights. And the US was considered progressive because it thought that the society was more open minded. But what's shocking now is the fact that it seems very similar. I mean, in the past 5 years, it seems like religion, like state and church, seem to have no
Hmm.
boundaries anymore, and there's a certain level of judgment that is creeping in, obviously on women. What a shocker! Um, on accessing those rights. And that's what, to me, the definition of a developed country is not just the laws that have been signed into its constitution, but also how people react to a certain situation. And this is a very aggressive way of handling something as sensitive as childbirth and something so personal.
It should never have been up for debate, but this is where we are, and I just thought it was important we discuss because I didn't.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And this is
Yeah.
an ongoing discussion, right? I mean, there are states like Kansas just you know uh, for the time being, they've stopped banning abortion rights, and other states, there's some that are full fledged just going and adopting the recent ban, and there's some states that are trying to work against it. So this is going to be an ongoing discussion. Let's see where we are. But I will say Trump definitely set into motion all of these things when he nominated people to the
Yeah,
Supreme Court.
it's been coming for a while, and I think people back
Yeah,
then were people who knew enough about this were saying it, and I didn't understand it as much because it didn't seem immediate. It didn't seem immediate,
exactly.
and now that it's
Yeah,
happened, it makes sense. It all makes sense.
with Brett Kavanaugh's nomination and all of it was a big hue and cry, and now we're seeing the effects of all of that Trump
Yeah.
basically set in
Anyway,
place.
I'm glad we talked about this. We will leave the
Agreed.
links to these articles in the description if anyone wants to access them. I think
Yeah,
information is key because, like, honestly, learning so
the
much about it
description
right
is
now, it does raise red flags for back then. If I'd looked at this back then, if it had happened back then, and I knew all this back then, I would have been a little more concerned, and I
yeah,
wasn't because I didn't understand it, and I do today.
yeah. I mean, even at this point, it's just important to
Yeah,
educate yourself on it, on what it
yeah,
really stands for, and then make up your mind whether you're for it or
right.
against it.
Yeah, don't just like don't celebrate or not celebrate because everyone else is or isn't doing it around you.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, please don't listen to Facebook articles that are propagating a false agenda, or even just listening to a YouTube video
Yeah.
like this one. Because at the end of the day, what you and I have are not
Yes.
facts and more opinions on what
Right.
we feel. So it's more important to kind of do your own research and read. So yeah, these articles will be shared in the description below for anybody who wants to kind of read into them.
All right.
Cool.